You're listening to His Generation Podcast, a weekly exploration into biblical truth as we explore the Word of God. His Generation Podcast airs every Sunday morning, so grab your Bible, and here we go. Good morning. This is His Generation Podcast, Sunday, November 30th. And things are going very quick this year, and so has our study through the Gospel of John. In fact, we are already at chapter 18, and I plan to go into chapter 19 a little bit also this morning. If you haven't been listening to His Generation Podcast as we go through the book of John, I would recommend you guys listen to the previous audio or video recordings here on Rumble and YouTube and check those things out. You might enjoy them. I have been taking an exploration through the Gospel of John with the emphasis of the theme of Deuteronomy 18:18. Which speaks of the prophecy of the Christ, that the words that he is going to speak are the very words of God himself as promised through the prophet Moses, that one would be raised up just like Moses, and that is the Christ to come. And of course, that is the fulfillment of Jesus Christ here on his earthly ministry. So, that will be the emphasis that we'll be looking at today, even as we go through John chapter 18. Well, it is a good morning, and I hope you guys have your coffee this morning. I know I do. I love coffee first thing in the morning. So we got a little bit of a late start, but we are here, and I'm just checking to make sure everything is working. Looks like we are live on Rumble, and looks like we are live on YouTube, and it looks like the majority of my equipment is working good, so I think we're going to get started here. Also, too, if you are in the live chat, you can go ahead and say good morning, or if you have any questions or things like that, I also take in those things. Here's the screen for the live chat in case you guys are curious what that looks like. Where is it? There it is. There's a screen for the live chat in case you guys are interested in doing that. Let me make sure my display is working really good here and before we get started. Real quick here and we'll get started. There we go. I think we're up and running. All right. Perfect. That's John chapter 18. All right. Well, let's get started, and we will get the party going here. John chapter 18. This is where we start to get to the decline of the story, which is really the height of the story, and that is Christ's sacrificial death and then resurrection. Because without the resurrection, folks, there is no faith in Christ. Without the resurrection, there is no gospel message. Because if Christ did not rise from the dead, then the things that are spoken about the historical Christ are just that. They're just another blip in history. But once we understand the significance of Christ's sacrifice and death and resurrection, then it is all a complete package. So that's what we're going to start to see, the decline of that. So let's get started in John chapter 18. It says there, let me fix my screen real quick. I'm sorry, guys. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty here, so I just want to make sure everything looks nice and pretty for y'all. All right, here we go. Perfect. Now I think we're ready to go. John chapter 18. When Jesus had spoken these words, Remember, he had just, by the way, he had just spoken the words of the prayer and in John chapter 17, the prayer not only for his disciples, but the disciples to come, which would include you and me right now listening to the very words of Christ as recorded in the gospel message of John. So John continues on with that and says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And then Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So they're in a familiar place where they often meet. And of course, Judas is now brought back into the story. And of course, Judas has that little tag about the betrayer of Jesus. And John specifically speaks of him like that because, again, going back to some older teachings that we did on the Gospel of John, if we're going to look at what does it mean to love one another as disciples, the opposite of that is probably a good way to start to understand what it means to love one another as disciples. And so the opposite of that is obviously Judas. He is the betrayer. And so that's why I think John specifically will designate him and identify him that way, because that is the opposite of what it means to love one another, as Jesus was teaching them in those final chapters of John chapter 13 and John chapter 14. So, verse 3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priest and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, and I think that's a great phrase right there, where John puts out that Jesus is knowing all things that would come upon him, because this situation, you're going to see a lot of free agency, and let's put it in those terms, because you're going to see Judas thinking, he has this free agency, or feeling free in his decision making, make some decisions. And then also too, we see Peter soon after that, feeling free in his decision making, make some decisions too. But ultimately, all the decisions that one makes, God is the decider, the ultimate decider. And that's something for us to understand, especially when it comes to our salvation. Because, you have the two camps, whether it's an Arminianist or a Calvinist, and it comes to how does salvation work, and then also do we have this thing called free will? And so you hear that debate, and it's been going on for centuries now. However, I would say here's a good proof text to really see the technicality of it, the practicality of it. Because here's Judas on one hand, who spent time with the Lord, heard the Lord's words, but then made his free agency decisions to do some things. And then you have Peter on the other hand, same scenario, just like Judas is there with the Lord, has heard the words of the Lord. And he's going to make some free agency decisions too. But in the end, the will of God is fulfilled, even though these decisions aren't decisions of righteousness. They're not decisions made with the thought of a holy mindset, a perfect mindset like God. You know what I mean? In fact, far from it. Here we see Judas actually betraying the Lord, and betraying him like hardcore, not just, he's basically bringing these people there to start a war. They got lanterns and torches and weapons, all that, because they were probably expecting, if they're going to take Jesus, the disciples were going to fight. And I'm sure that's what Judas had told them. And of course, Peter, we'll see him there, probably was ready to fight because he had a sword on him. And so so those things aren't far-fetched, but nevertheless, Peter and Judas are working in their free agency, their own decision making. But are they really free agents? Or is Christ in control? Well, according to verse 4, Christ is in control, because it says there, Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him. And of course, he went forward and said to them, whom are you seeking? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, I am he. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. It's not a good scene. It's heartbreaking if you really think about it. If you have friends that have betrayed you, or thought, you thought you were really close, and then they turn around and do something like that, that's basically what you're seeing there. And so it's a hard situation. But more than that, this is the one that everyone in that crowd had been waiting for, as far as their Judaism, their practice of Judaism, their segregating themselves purposely within the world to maintain their Jewish and Israeli or Israelite identity. And so this is the Christ that was come to deliver them as promised through the prophets. And yet they're ready to turn him in. And I think that's what I want to emphasize as we go through this, because as it starts to unpack, you're going to see how everything that Christ is challenged and hated. And remember, these are those whom he was sent to. When you start to think of the things like the parable of the vine dresser sending his son to the vineyard, and of course the ones that were renting the vineyard from the vine dresser, they say, hey, let's kill his son so there's no inheritance and we get to take over the land. And that's pretty much what's going on here. That parable is coming to life in real time. And so Judas is there standing with them. Verse 6, now, when he had said to them, Jesus that is, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. And because, again, this is John's main theme, the very words that come out of the Lord's mouth, out of Jesus' mouth, are what they're required to hear, because it's the very words of God. So when he says, I am he, no wonder why they drew back and fell to the ground. And then he asked them, whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, speaking of his disciples, that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spoke, of these whom you gave me, I have lost none. And so we're going back to what John was talking about in John chapter 17 and 16. And that's when Jesus was praying to the Father, and that was one statement that he made there to him. And so that's also relevant too, because there's going to be some things with Peter that are going to happen that are also going to come to fulfillment. Because again, Deuteronomy 18:18, the words that Jesus is speaking are the words of God. And if you get down to Deuteronomy 18:20, you start to see there very clearly what qualifies this person. And the one thing that qualifies this person that is sent by God, according to the Deuteronomy 18 prophecy, is the words that he speaks, they come true, or they come to be fulfilled. And how do you know it's not the prophet? Well, if the words that he speaks don't come to be fulfilled, then you know. So it's real simple. It's the litmus test. If the words that Jesus speaks come true, then boom, he's the Deuteronomy 18:18 prophecy fulfillment. But if they don't, then boom, that's not the one. But in this case, this is the one, and John will point that out over and over again. Verse 10, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And so Jesus said to Peter, put your sword in your sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? And then again, so we have the contrast. John is doing this very purposely. We have Judas there, the betrayer, and then we have the disciple that's impulsive, Peter. Both of them acting in their free agency will. But is their free agency will really free? That's the question. That's the debate of the Arminians and the Calvinists throughout the centuries. But here's a good proof text, because they believe that they're operating according to the way that they want to operate. And their actions, of course, are very unrighteous. Nevertheless, God in the flesh, which is Christ here, corrects it. Because there's a bigger redemptive purpose here. That's why, of course, John said Jesus knew all things. And of course, that's why we see here at the very end, the rebuke that he gives to Peter. He says, "Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" And we saw that in the prayer that he had to his Father there in John chapter 17, where he was in anguish, saying, "Hey, if this cup can pass, then let it. But nevertheless, your will be done." God the Son speaking to God the Father. And this again, the fulfillment. This is the fulfillment. The words that Jesus spoke are coming true in this very moment. Well, verse 12, then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. And so now this is where we get into his interaction with the high priest. And this is very significant, because you're going to see Jesus in three different roles in this text. One, you're going to see Jesus as the prophet. And this is something you've seen probably in the last couple of chapters, because the words that he's speaking are coming true. So he is that prophet. You're also going to see Jesus, who is the true high priest, according to the Hebrews argument. And we'll go a little bit into the Hebrews argument as we get through this text here. But you're going to see him as the true high priest in front of the earthly high priest. So it's the heavenly high priest in front of the earthly high priest. And you're going to see that interaction and what it looks like. Because what it looks like in that interaction in this text right here is telling you the reality about the depravity of our human state, and why the severity of Christ having to die on the cross for the redemption of mankind is there, because the severity and the stupidity and the blindness of the Jewish people here specifically, and of course all humanity, is going to come to the forefront. And you need to see it that way, because there's a severity here. Man is severely lost, so much so when the one thing that saves them is right in front of their face, they deny it, disregard it, and even to the point want to destroy and kill it. That's how deep the depravity of mankind is. And so we're going to see that come to the forefront here as the heavenly high priest enters in to the realm of the earthly high priest. And we'll see a little bit of that. We'll unpack it in Hebrews 2 as we go along here. So they go to Caiaphas and Annas. Annas, of course, is the father-in-law of the high priest, and so there's like almost like a dual rulership there, because I guess Annas is respected as the high priest of old, but then Caiaphas is his son-in-law, which is the current high priest. Both of the Levite tribe, you have to assume, and that's why they would qualify for the high priest position. Verse 14, now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And of course, that is in the high priestly role. There is the opportunity that God, the Holy Spirit, will come upon that role, because it's not about the high priest; it's about the office of the high priest leading the Israelites. And that was why, for instance, God the Holy Spirit would get involved in those points, whether it was the king of Israel, or whether it was the high priest of Israel, or whether it was a prophet of Israel, like Isaiah or Jeremiah. It was always for the purpose, because there was a redemptive value that God had concern with the Israelites. And so God the Holy Spirit at times would come upon those leaders. And so there was a time at some point when Caiaphas said this very truth, that one man should die for the people, because basically he was prophesying of Christ, death, and atonement for the people. Verse 15, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. And this is John kind of keeping it nonchalant, as the kids say nowadays, where he is also there involved in the crowd. So you got Peter and you got John the apostle. Now the disciple, speaking of John, was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. And then the other disciple, who was known by the high priest, this is John, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. So now you got Peter, John, and Jesus. They're there in the courtyard of the high priest, and this is how it's going to go down. Verse 17. The servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And of course, Peter said, "I am not." Now, this is where we're going to see the fulfillment of John chapter 13. And for reference, I'll go back to it. So here's John chapter 13, where Simon Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus answered him, saying, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me, but you shall follow me afterwards." And then Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake." And then Jesus answered him, corrected that impulsiveness of Peter, and said, "Will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times." And so this is the fulfillment of this prophecy. Again, John is specifically putting these prophecies out there that are being fulfilled, because this is the Deuteronomy 18:18 qualification. Whatever Jesus says will come true, because he's speaking the words of God. And so getting back to our text, where we see there at verse 17, Peter says, "I am not." That's denial number 1. Next, 18. Now the servants and the officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. So the high priest, now getting back to Jesus and the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Now remember, this is the earthly high priest asking the heavenly high priest. Now, if it came to order, which outranks what the other one? Obviously, the heavenly high priest. But yet, the earthly high priest here does not know that, and so I mean, I'm not trying to make it more horrible than it is, because it is horrible. But nevertheless, there is ignorance that is there. But nevertheless, this is very telling of all of humanity when it comes to Christ and who he is, the person of Christ, God the Son, the eternal Son, like those type of things. People just don't know. They're ignorant of that. And so here is a situation where this one man who claims to be a representative of God to the Israelites, in fact, the highest representation, because he is the high priest there, when it comes to ceremonial worship of God to the Israelites. But yet God the Son is right before his face, and he is ignorant, and he can't even tell that. But we'll see how far that ignorance goes, and that's where we're working through this text, and you can kind of identify that thing as you understand not only your own your own position as you came to the Lord, but also to those that maybe you are praying for or sharing the gospel with, because this is how bad it gets. So just remember that as you share about Christ and try to reveal who Christ is to a lost world. It says there, Jesus answered him in regards to his doctrine, his disciples. Jesus answered the high priest. He says, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always met, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, when Jesus had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? So this is where you start to see the extreme of it. The heavenly high priest is answering very honestly and very detailed to the high priest the truth of what the high priest is seeking. Because is the high priest really seeking truth? I don't know. I don't know. But nevertheless, Jesus gives him the information. He doesn't give him the entirety of his doctrine. He doesn't sit there and start to, open Isaiah like he would with the disciples, or talk through the Psalms like he would with the disciples. But he does tell him, everyone here knows what I've said. Just ask them. It's that simple. But those around him didn't like that, and so they smacked Jesus. And then, of course, Jesus, responding that, he said this, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? And there it is. It's the high priest speaking to the earthly high priest. And of course, this is the result. Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So after all this, he inquired. And of course, Jesus obliged his inquiry, yet it wasn't enough. And so a smack and bound and throwing him out. And of course, they're going to go to Pilate from this point. They're going to take it to the governor of the Roman Empire there in Israel. But continuing on the story, you got verse 25 says there, now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself, and therefore they said to him, you are not also one of his disciples, are you? And of course, Peter denied it and said, I am not. So there is denial number 2. And verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of whose ear Peter had cut off, that was Malchus in the beginning of the story, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So there's the 3, according to John chapter 13. And of course, at the end of the 3, the rooster crowed just like Jesus said it would. So John continuing showing over and over again the reality of Jesus and his words and his position as a prophet. Now transitions to his position as the high priest. But I wanted to show a little bit of the Hebrews argument, because in Hebrews, the author of Hebrews points out these 3 very distinct offices that are related to the person and work of Christ. Number 1 is going to be the prophet. And of course, we see there in, I think it's Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. It says, God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. So when it comes to Christ in his person and work being the prophet, right, spoken of in Deuteronomy 18:18, and here is the Hebrews' argument for that he was the prophet, and that not only was he there at the beginning of the foundation of the world, for all things were created through him and by him, but more and less than that, he was the one by his word of his power purged our sins and sat down right hand on the majesty on high. So that's the when it comes to the office of the prophet of Christ, the prophet, he holds that prophet office. There it is. It's the highest of the highest. There's nothing through there. But then the author of Hebrews goes on to argue further on about the high priest role of Christ, because he is the heavenly high priest, because all the things, according to the author of Hebrews, all the things that are talked about with the ceremonial high priest and his function and his role were all types and shadows of things to come in the true office of the heavenly high priest that was going to offer one sacrifice, and that was the end of it. And so we have there, first off, in Hebrews 9:11 through 15, this is what it says. It says, "But Christ came as a high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant, by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance." So Christ, being that perfect sacrifice in his high priest role, of course, the heavenly high priest, for that very purpose, did and completed and was about to complete, in this storyline at least, what the role of the high priest, the earthly high priest, was for. Because the earthly high priest was there to offer the sacrifices to get things cleansed and purified, so they can worship God that one time a year, right? Or even to the point where the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. But the high priest needs sacrifices, the heavenly high priest, for not only himself, but for the people. He can't even enter in the Holy of Holies until he does a bunch of ritual sacrifices. But here's Christ, spotless, who did that very work. And the outcomes of that very work are severe for all of humanity. The goodness and the severity, as it says there in the Romans dialogue or rhetoric, that's what happens, because it says there in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 14, that the redemptive sacrificial work of Christ in his high priest role cleanses your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So Caiaphas, getting back to our story, Caiaphas sitting there, right? And knowing what he has to do on a year-to-year basis to do some kind of work, right, before God in the temple, the very means of bringing his soul to be cleansed, to where he doesn't have to do these sacrifices anymore is standing there right in front of him. Yet, in his ignorance, what does he do to Jesus? Smacks him, bounds him, and then ships him off over to Pilate. The high priest the heavenly high priest is before the earthly high priest. And I wanted to point that out because that's what we're seeing here. So we see Jesus as the prophet, we see him as the high priest, and then now as he gets over to Pilate, we're going to see him as his third role, which is the King of Kings. And so let's continue on in the story. So verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the Praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now remember, this is the Passover season. That's why Jesus is in Jerusalem, because also too, again, the Passover was a shadow, a type and shadow of things to come, because the true sacrificial lamb, which is sacrificed and eaten at the Passover time, is Jesus Christ. And of course, everything's symbolic, whether it's the role of the earthly high priest, whether it's the sacrifices that they do, whether it's the high holiday that they celebrate. It all points to the coming work of Christ, and he is right there in their midst. But they don't realize that, of course, until afterwards, because if they had realized who he is, they would have never sacrificed him, according to the Corinthians argument. Because if they would have sacrificed him, if they would have not sacrificed him, then the plan of redemption would have not gone through. But nevertheless, who is in control? God is in control. And so man can operate in their deceived understanding of their free agency and their decision making, but the reality is God is in control. And we'll see it over and over again, especially in this story. Even though it seems very bleak and dark, nevertheless, it was done for a purpose. Well, they're right there in the Praetorium, and that is the palace where Pilate rules from. And then Pontius Pilate, of course, is the Roman governor at the time there over the Judean area of Israel. And of course, Pilate now gets involved in the conversation. Verse 29. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Speaking of Jesus. And they answered him, said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Oh gosh. I chuckle because I'm thinking that's like the worst logic ever. That's like the logical fallacy of saying, well, the experts say, right? Well, what do they say doesn't mean if it's right or wrong. What do they say? And so rather than telling them what they say, they just say, well, because they're experts. Anyways, so if they say to him, if he was not an evildoer, we not have delivered him to you. And then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore, the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Wow. A crime worthy of death. Let's see what it is. Verse 32. That the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Of course, this is John referencing back to things that he said earlier in chapters 15, 16, and 17. Then Pilate entered the Praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And this is where we begin to see the argument, or I shouldn't say it's not argument, but just where we see highlighted that Jesus is the last office, King of Kings. And so Pilate directly asked him that. And let's watch how Jesus answers these things, because it's very interesting. Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" And Pilate said, "Am I a Jew? Your nation and the chief priests, plural, have delivered you to me. What have you done? And Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? And Jesus answered, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness of the truth, and everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So, when it comes to the office of king, there's some things you need to consider, because it's not an earthly king. He says it very clearly. This is my kingdom isn't of this world, because if it was, my servants would fight. So my kingdom is not from here. So not only is his role as prophet, high priest, but also of king, are all in the sense of his heavenly eternalness. Because if it was of this world, or it was of this earth, it's temporal. Everything of this earth is temporal. But because it isn't of this world, there's an eternal aspect of it. Because according to the Hebrews argument, and I'll get into that, everything in this world is going to fade away. And what lasts is of God. Well, that sounds kind of a contradiction, doesn't it? Because you said everything. Well, hold on. Let's look at the Hebrews argument, because I think the Hebrew argument explains it best when it comes to the kingship of Christ. It says there in Hebrews 12, verses 25 through 29. I think that's the best way to explain it there. It says, seeing that you do not refuse him who speaks, speaking of Christ, for if they did not escape who refused him to speak on earth, how much shall we not escape if we turn away from he who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth? But now has he promised, saying, yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this, yet once more, indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of the things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. So we're talking about the judgment to come. And with that judgment to come, all things will pass on this earth. The things that remain, in the case of the things that have Christ and all of his authority of the judge and the living and the dead has signified to his ownership, will remain. And that's what he's talking about here. So that's the concept that goes back into our text, where Jesus says, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness of the truth, and everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So, if you hear his voice, you understand, you will remain. Because as the earth is shaken, not only the earth will be shaken, but the heavens will be shaken. And what will remain is what is under the authority and ownership of Christ. Like the good shepherd, they hear his voice and they come to him. And that's what he's talking about here. Because all those that are following Jesus at this point are the ones that hear the truth that comes from him. Guys like John, guys like Peter. Although Peter's following is a little sloppy, nevertheless, he is the possession of Christ. He is the sheep of Christ. In fact, that's why we end John's gospel in John chapter 21, spoiler alert, where Jesus says specifically to Peter in his restoration of Peter from this betrayal that we see there, denial, I should say not betrayal, but denial that we see from Peter. We see there, Jesus says to him, feed my sheep. So there's a lot going on here, but let's get back to the story, because Pilate has a response in John chapter 38. And Pilate said to Jesus, what is truth? What a timely response. This is the whole point of it, but okay, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And so, sarcastically, he says it that way. Then they all cried again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, who is Barabbas? Well, John will explain that to us. So Barabbas was also there at the time, and he was arrested. And so you got two people that were arrested before the governor of Pilate to get judgment. One is, of course, Jesus the Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, as they would probably call him back then in the court. And then the other one is Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. And of course, more than a robber, but he was a murderer too. And they were willing to take Barabbas over Jesus. So if you want to look at the other gospel accounts, especially Luke, you get a more detailed version of who Barabbas is. So it's a great tragedy. It's scandalous. All this is very scandalous. It's the ignorance, the corruptness, the depravity, the power grabbing of humanity in some of its highest moments. And that's what's going on here. And this is what all led up to the crucifixion of the Christ. And so this is what's interesting to see this all in the backdrop and brought to light by John, because this is the reality. This is who you and I really are apart from a redemptive work of Christ. This is what all of humanity is as they reject Christ. This is the reality of it. Don't get it twisted. It's not... There is no good people in this world. There might be people that do decent acts and kind acts and things like that, but the reality, when it comes down to the scrubbing of their soul, the bone and marrow of their soul, there is no good people. There is no good people. Once you understand that, you tend to navigate life a little bit better, and you tend to worship Christ a little bit stronger and focused, because I am one of those people that's not good, but yet not I, but Christ has redeemed me, transformed me, converted me. And that's the idea behind that. Well, Barabbas was one of those people, but Barabbas was no different than the high priest, no different than Pilate, no different than Judas. He is the same as them, needing of the Christ, I should say. But Christ is right there before them. What happens? Well, another spoiler, when we see Christ there actually being crucified in John chapter 20, we see also there too, two other men being crucified with him. And one of those other men, knowing he deserved to be crucified, but Jesus didn't, repented and gave his life to the Lord, understanding his depth of his depravity, and there's no saving himself. So he turns to one who does not deserve to die to save him, and that is Christ on the cross. But nevertheless, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's look back at Barabbas. We go into John chapter 19 now, verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Then Pilate went out again and said to them, "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." And then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So they're mocking Jesus. So here's the reality, right? Let's get back to that Hebrews text. Let's go back to Hebrews chapter 12, 25. Verse 28 specifically, "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. See, this is where we start to get into the understanding of the meekness of Christ. Because here is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and they put a crown of thorns on him, and they give him some purple robe, and they smack him around and mock him. Hail the King of the Jews, mockingly they say that to him. And how does Christ react? How could he react if he wanted to? Well, according to the Hebrews text, he's a consuming fire. That's judgment, kids. That's judgment talk. Yet, he does not react accordingly to how he could, as far as his power and majesty. So, remembering that, you look at this story and your application is this. Although they tried to shake him as king, shake him down, right? He could not be shaken, because it was the will of the Father that this all happens, that he died this brutal death, that his personage, right, as king, priest, and prophet, all attempted to be diminished and smeared by those that he created, for the purpose to save those that he created in his sacrifice. So that's why we serve, and this is the application, reading this verse, we serve him with reverence and godly fear. Because he could have wiped everything out there at that moment. He could have did a Noah's Ark revival and just flooded everything. Well, he wouldn't flooded it, but he could have just consumed it all in fire. And said, done. But he sacrificed instead. Because remember when he said in John chapter 13, 14, no greater love has a friend than he laid down his life for his friend. All those that you've given me, I will protect. Speaking of disciples, speaking of those to come in the future because of the word of the disciples, the gospel of the disciples. This is what it was all for. This is love. This is the love that we have been brought into. This eternal love that was before the foundations of the world. Because the love that we've been brought into, this action, was the love that God the Son has past tense with God the Father before the worlds were even created. It's not earthly love. There's no earthly love in this situation whatsoever. In fact, it's the depth of depravity. They have the very King of Kings, the one that can consume them, but yet they think their power is so mighty, so much so that they go, let's put a crown of thorns on him, smack him around, and put a purple robe on him, and then mock him. Oh, hail the King of the Jews. Not a good look. It ain't going to work out well in the end. That's why we today, who have been saved out of that, serve God with reverence and godly fear. Right? That's what it means. It's a real simple application. Well, getting back to the story, going back to John chapter 19 now, of course, Pilate says, behold the man. In verse 6, it says, therefore, when the chief priests and the officers saw him, these are the chief priests saying this, right? They're leading the men to say this. They cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. And then Jesus answered him, then the Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. There's the accusation. That's what they really don't like. The reality is this, folks, this hasn't changed. So this antichrist sentiment, that's what that is. It's antichrist sentiment is still here today in this world. So when you see these problems, like for instance, in politics and the public schools and The tensions between family members and people and different countries and the global wars that start and these mass genocides and all these other things. The reality is, it's just this like violent suppression of truth. So, and it's a violent suppression of the truth that Christ is the Son of God, and he died, sacrificed, and resurrected. And because he resurrected, it validates what he said. And what he said is truly that he is the Son of God. And that's what they hate. That's what they hate, and they want to suppress that. So this spirit of Antichrist is right there in its height of depravity. We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Well, it's kind of a double entendre statement there, because the reality is the Son of God did have to die. They were just too blind to see that in the scriptures. Isaiah 52, right? They were just too blind to see it. But nevertheless, he had to die. They were true in saying that, but they were saying it out of an evil heart, not as glorifying God through his word in the Holy Scriptures. So verse 8, therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid and went out into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?" Oh, okay. And this is, again, Christ in his true King of King role. He's letting them do this to him. It's not a matter of he's, he has no say in any of this. No, it's his obedience to God the Father that's giving him the ability to do all this. But it's part of a plan. And of course, Jesus answered and said to him, verse 11, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." And from that on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." And of course, they're speaking correctly, because there's only one king in the Roman Empire, and that's Caesar. And anyone who would try to roll up against him, that's who they were. That would be like treason and sedition. And so that's why they're saying that, because the governor is at the pleasure of Caesar. In other words, what Caesar appoints him to do, he does. He's not really in charge in Rome. He's just part of the government system. And so when Pilate therefore heard this saying, he brought Jesus out and sat him down in the judgment seat in the palace that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, about the 6th hour, and he had said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." And then Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the high priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So there's the high priest. Speaking of the high priest role, remember? Going back to that idea. Little did they know that this heavenly high priest before them was the very outcome and expression of why they were even operating in that role of a high priest, as a type and shadow to come to their true deliverance as Israelites. Because we have in other scriptures in Hebrews explaining that role very clearly. For instance, we have in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 11 through 14, where where the author of Hebrews argues very clearly and says this: "And every high priest stands ministering daily and offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But this man, speaking of the Christ, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God, from that time waiting till his enemies are made his footstool. By one offering he has made perfect forever those who are being sanctified. So it's interesting. And there's another verse I wanted to share with you guys too. Here is Hebrews 9, verses 11 through 12, speaking of that high priest role. Remember, these are the chief priest saying to Pilate, we have no other king but Caesar. Okay, well, here is another fault of theirs, not recognizing who the Christ was. But in Hebrews 9, 11 through 15, it says this, but Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh. How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And of course, for this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant, which they were waiting for. They were waiting for the new covenant. They know Jeremiah 31, by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. And so all those things, promises of the prophets, of the scriptures, of even the Torah, that speaks of the Levitical role as the priestly offices, is all summed up right before them in the person and work of Christ, right before their eyes. But yet in their blindness, their ignorances, and their depravity, and I would say also too, their anti-Christ sentiment, they say, we have no king but Caesar. In verse 16, this is where we'll wrap up. Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus and led him away. Wow. There it is. That is John chapter 18 and the beginning of John chapter 19, where we see Jesus in his three heavenly offices as the prophet spoken about by Moses in Deuteronomy 18:18. We see him also there too as the heavenly high priest, which is the true expression and outcome of the earthly high priest. And then lastly, we see him there as the eternal king, as promised in the Davidic covenant. On your throne will sit an everlasting king. So we see those three roles being very much played out here in just this small text of John chapter 18 through 19. I wanted to point those out because the application is simple. We, before Christ, were just like Judas. We're just like Pontius Pilate. We were just like the chief priest. We were just like Barabbas to some extent. But yet Christ, in his meekness, in his love for those that would come to him, what it says in John chapter 10, his sheep hear his voice as the good shepherd, held himself, right? He controlled himself through that to the extent of even letting them crucify him. And of course, the ending of that is the Roman guards sticking the spear up his side to bleed him out so they can take him down, know that he's dead for sure. That's the end result of it. It is horrible. It was a horrible injustice and mistreatment. But again, the power under control there to be obedient to God the Father for the redemption of humans, right, of his creation is what we see there. Because no matter what they did to him, no matter what they thought about him, no matter what they believed or didn't believe, none of that mattered. He was on mission to do exactly what he wanted to do. And of course, he will do what he wants to do. And so when we start talking about, oh, God is sovereign, this is what the sovereignty looks like. It's a very clear picture of that. He is going to do what he's going to do. He's going to exist whether you exist or not. He's going to hold these titles of prophet and high priest and king and Lord, whether you accept those or not, whether you mock him or not, whether you worship him or not. He is who he is, and that's a severe reality that we need to understand. And that's why the Hebrew author would say very clearly there, our God is a consuming fire, because he is. So I wanted to leave you guys with that. So, God bless you on the Lord's Day today. On Sunday, I hope that you attend a local church to go worship Christ and represent either you and your family. But I would encourage you to do that because, again, that's part of the reverence and godly fear, but it's also, too, part of the goodness and grace that God gives to us that we want to worship him and gather in his name. So thank you for joining me here on His Generation podcast, and we will see you next week.
I don't wanna act too high and mighty, 'cause tomorrow I may fall down on my face. Lord, I thank you for sunshine, thank you for rain, thank you for joy, thank you for pain. It's a beautiful day, it's a beautiful day. Lord, I thank you for sunshine, thank you for rain, thank you for joy, thank you for pain. It's a beautiful day, it's a beautiful day, it's a beautiful day. Sometimes life is good, and then trouble comes my way. But whatever happens, Lord, I thank you for this day. When I'm feeling troubled, I raise my hands and pray that your will be done in the rain or sun. Oh, it's a beautiful day. I don't wanna act too high and mighty, 'cause tomorrow I may fall down on my face. Lord, I thank you for sunshine, thank you for rain, thank you for joy,